Thank you all for joining us for session 4, and I will turn it over to Bonnie Clairmont to get us started.
Hey, thank you, Abby and Heather. So I want to spend just a little bit of time this afternoon talking about the overview of the advocate's role, just to provide some clarity about how the advocate's role came to be as a model. Next slide. So when working with people who encounter a variety of problems in today's society, it's based on a lot of different models, right? We have people who require services with chemical abuse issues, so there's a model there. People who require help within the medical field, right, with illnesses or health issues, and there's a medical model there. People who have mental health issues, oftentimes that's associated with the medical model because of the need for diagnoses and treatment, right? The model of advocacy is its own model. And I hesitate calling it a model, right? Because often it's, it's taught models are often taught in colleges and higher institutions of learning, and yet advocacy generally isn't taught in higher institutions of learning. It came about because there was a need, because these issues, the domestic violence, sexual assault was occurring at really disproportionately high levels in our communities, and there was a need for those people who were impacted, a need for support, unique type of support. So the model was born out of that need, right? So there's a medical model versus the advocacy model, which oftentimes we refer to it as grassroots model, because there are advocates that are based in government agencies, like in Assistant U.S. Attorney's Office. They're called victim witness coordinators, victim witness advocates. And their duty is they're accountable to that system under which they work, right? They have to work closely with prosecutors. So any information shared with the victim is shared with the prosecutors. So it doesn't end at the advocate, right? So it's not generally considered confidential to all outside parties. So I want to discuss that a little bit with you to have you have some clarity if you don't already, and then talk about the role of advocates. Okay, next slide. And these are the objectives for today. Participants will be able to describe the difference between advocates, mental health, social service providers, and describe how cultural belief systems are connected to working relationships. When I talked earlier about a hierarchy, and generally those models are based in a hierarchical kind of a setting. There was a period of time where advocacy didn't, they were trying to get away from that to more of a collective thinking where everyone in that advocacy program were equal to the, administrators and so forth, but didn't work quite as well as they wanted. So most agencies have moved away from that collective model within mainstream, but still I think it can operate like that within our tribal programs, that we have that sense of equality with one another, that no one is more powerful than the other, that we all have information that we can bring, have skills, have knowledge that we can bring to the table. And like I said earlier, none of this is actually taught to people in higher institutions of learning. So I think it becomes really important that advocates, they hone their skills with experience, right? And that peer support, learning from one another, as well as learning from those that we serve, right? Because they have a lot of information to provide us, to help us to further this work of advocacy. Okay. Next slide. So advocacy is different from other fields, as I've already said. It's different than social work. And in even the language, I always say there's a lot of power in our language. Oftentimes terms like case management, right, is used. And, it's kind of the language of that hierarchical system that I talked about earlier, where you have decision makers at the top, right? And say, for example, within a social services agency, child protection, you have people who are making decisions for this. Say, for example, it's a woman who's had her kids removed for failure to protect. There's a something called failure to protect when she isn't the primary perpetrator, but she's returned to the perpetrator and her children are witnessing that violence. So basically mom gets the children taken from her for failure to protect. We see that happen all too often. So there's a case review that's done by a team of professionals, right? Maybe a child psychologist, maybe a child protection worker, a family social service social worker, maybe law enforcement, maybe an advocate if we're invited. We can sit in on those meetings where a case plan is developed, right? And she has to follow that case plan. And then it's brought to court for adjudication where she's court ordered to adhere to this case plan. And then her case is managed by a social worker. Then she meets with her social worker to see if she's doing these things that she was court ordered to do, right? That's within the context of social work and case management. In an advocacy model, we're about empowerment. We're really about empowering that person, because when we talk about violence happening to someone, their power has been taken, right? The primary motive for domestic violence, sexual assault, is for power and control. Power and control. That perpetrator wanting to feel powerful by using this act, by choosing this act of violence against the victim, they're made to feel powerful. That's how they're gaining their power. And again, it's based on their feeling of entitlement that I get to do this, I can, So our job as advocates, as responders, as service providers, whoever it is, our job is to re-empower that victim, give that victim back their choices and supporting their choices that they make, right? So case management is not a term that should be used along with advocacy, but oftentimes I see that happening and I get really concerned because, again, advocacy is different than social work. Otherwise, even, if we're doing that, there's a potential that we're going to start taking on the quality and the elements of that model of social work into advocacy, right? Or it's even chemical dependency. We're going to start, maybe we start to take on that identity. When we're a model in and of itself, the advocacy model, right? It's really important that we look at that always to maintain the integrity of the advocacy model, because it was born out of the need for certain kinds of responses that victims need. Advocacy requires knowledge of multiple issues, and things change, right? So advocacy involves staying current with all of these issues. Whatever kinds of problems that our communities are facing, we have to stay current with those issues. And advocacy is to create social change must consider cultural belief systems to be effective. Again, we talked quite a bit this morning about, our cultural and our life ways, to be exact, and how that will sustain us in our work, right? So always having those central to what we do and the work that we do, even in terms of the context of social change, that we're referring back to our life ways, back to how we were as a people before colonization, that some of those things can still apply to our work as advocates. So it's more than just a model. I have a hard time calling it a model sometimes, because it really is about being good relatives to help one another. So it's much more about relationships, and incorporating our spiritual and traditional beliefs into the work that we do as advocates. Okay. Next slide. Advocacy requires self-reflection and a constant challenge of our internalized oppression and colonized beliefs. You know, it's something that we all have to take time to do. And I think self-care, when we get too far removed from self-care, I think it's easy for us to sort of veer away from that in terms of how we're doing our work. It's easy for us to start to have it take on the appearance of a social work model, a social work system. And again, you know, we're talking about trying to utilize one model that may not work, right? You know, and I always have this feeling, and I probably shouldn't, but I always have this attitude that social work has had this history of stealing our children, you know, and that it's not always about that, but in my mind, that's kind of how I perceive often of child protection workers and so forth. So we have to be really careful that we maintain the integrity of advocacy. We have to take advantage and be aware of our socialization and to make change in the way we approach our work as advocates. So socialization, including our education, can be products of mainstream culture. We can be colluded, right? Become colluded with that outside education. And it's okay if we can take in that outside education as long as we're balancing it with our own life ways. Okay. There's difference between bicultural and cultural confusion resulting from oppression, internalized oppression. So again, you know, yes, there's, you know, bicultural exists within us, you know, because we're influenced by a lot of different sources. But bottom line, you know, it's important for us to look at it and really still be able to fall back on what we know, and which is our own ways. Next slide. So these next few slides are pointing out some of the differences between a medical model or a social service model also, and our grassroots advocacy model. And also, and I'll use all these terms sort of interchangeably, right? The social change, advocacy, grassroots, those are all sort of descriptions of the model of advocacy. They all sort of blend together to describe the advocacy model. Under direct services, and I'm going to go through these kind of quickly, questioning seen as negative, right? Resistant. You have someone who is saying, why should I have to do that? Or why are you going to do that? Or why are you making me do that? You know, and at the same time, on the other side of that, as advocates, we want to empower people that we're working with, because that disempowerment happened as a result of that trauma. That was the motive, right? So we want to re-empower people with their own decision-making and trust their decision-making and support their choices, right? We also want to empower them and encourage critical thinking, because that ultimately is going to help them with their own healing and their own regaining their own sense of internal power, right? That they have the ability to do that. No socializing, personal contact is in this kind of a medical model systems, you know, that hierarchical system. We're not supposed to cry, or, you know, we're not supposed to engage in social events together, right? And yet that's kind of goes against the grain. You know, we do socialize together. You know, advocates often even say they, you know, invite people they're working with to ceremonies. Professional sets rules and limits a relationship. And that's good to a certain extent, but when we're talking so rigid, I think that's difficult for us, because our system is much more natural, right? It's a natural system of how we help one another as relatives. There's no hard and fast rule about it, right? Limited self-disclosure, emoting. You know, this is one of the things that I always say, if I'm going to stop, when I stop feeling and maybe even shedding a tear with that person I'm working with when they're shedding a tear. And I have that feeling I'm going to be genuine, and I may do that with that person. I'm not so cold-hearted that I'm going to sit there, like, even though I have these feelings within me. It really is about providing that almost like a peer-to-peer support. Okay. Oftentimes expertise is by experience rather than by education. Some of the best advocates I know are survivors themselves, who've gone through the system and who've gotten trained and have gained a lot of experience doing the work on the ground. We support decisions made by those that we're working with. We relate to one another as relatives and as peers. And the relationship is mutually determined. If that person I'm working with no longer wants me to work with them, that's completely open. It's not a forced thing that's ordered under like a judge or under a case management. And then we don't treat the people we're working with as though they're sick or that there's something wrong with them, right? Their victimization doesn't identify them. I never see the people I'm working with as kind of like broken. It's amazing to me that no matter how much someone is harmed, they're still able to get up every day and go to work or go to school. It's like, that's amazing. Or even come in to talk with me about what happened. So it's a balance, all aspects of that person as a whole person. Next slide. Often in the medical model, there's diagnoses and prognoses and tangible measures, symptoms, all of that, along with the treatment plan, right? And it's usually directed by someone outside of that person. When we really stress the importance of personal sovereignty, giving back their own locus of control over decisions they make. On the medical side, they focus on individual as a single person by themselves and what they need individually. When, within the context of oppression, it's really about relationships. That person is part of a family, that's part of a community, part of a cultural, within a cultural context. So it's hard to just say, I'm just dealing with this person and that's it. Limited relationship referral /referral, we we help that person make a lot of connections to resources that can help them. Money insurance is a really primary focus. Paperwork is a primary focus. We try to really limit that in terms of how much paperwork we do with people we're working with. That should not be at the forefront and on a higher level of importance. Our victims or patients, whatever you want to call them in that medical model, sometimes their credibility is questioned. And vice versa. Sometimes there's questioning is thought to be not a good thing. If the victim or the patient is questioning the person in authority. But yet, we're really empowering victims that we work with to question things. That critical thinking, again, is really important. They get to do that, right? They get to question things because this is something that's going to impact them. They get to do that. Next slide. Formal education, formally educated, there's specializations. When on the grassroots side, we're looking at more life experiences that can inform this work. Again, back to our cultural traditions. See the person as a whole person, not just in parts or seeing part of that person. And I already talked about paperwork. Paperwork becomes secondary. Works with individual behavior. We work with a range of resources and again, what can be helpful to that victim to be re-empowered and heal. So it's important for us to look at all aspects, including even just basic needs that victims need. Okay. And along with that is to look at how are those resources in our community? Are they being made accessible to victims? In housing, sometimes in our communities, there's a waiting list, right, for housing, for good housing. Maybe, as part of our role as advocates, we work with the head of housing to look at how can you prioritize victims, maybe save space up there for people who, like single mothers who need some quality housing, affordable housing. Maybe they have children and they're having a hard time finding adequate housing in outside of the community. Can we make space? Can we hold certain spaces or certain houses for victims that are coming out of these situations? Next slide. And on the medical social service side, counseling side, there's a social and organizational structures hierarchy. Again, it's important for us to maintain that circle even in our workplaces, right? So that we're not replicating that, the models that we talked about earlier. There's a head, it becomes deep, it becomes more of it is about the mental kind of thinking that goes into the service providers, the kind of like it's much more about sort of, thinking about processing what's going to be good for this person rather than from the heart, right? And that's some of the things that we, can share with even within a SART. Accountability to hierarchy. In these settings, we're all, when they do case management, is everyone needs to be on board with this case plan, and everyone has to hold that person accountable to the case plan, right? The accountability then goes more towards the hierarchy and the system versus accountability to that person who has been impacted. There's a bureaucracy in place. It's often very disempowering to the individual, and we see those kind of oppressive kind of tactics being used. And then distrust is then born out of that. So it's really important that we not replicate that in the work of advocacy, but we're much more about, believing and trusting that person's process, respecting them, providing support that they need, and having that genuineness with the people that we're working with, and incorporating those within our mission, within our philosophy statements, right? And then in the model of advocacy that we continue to look at it as a viable model. Okay, next slide. So the role of advocates, you'll be able to describe the principles and responsibilities of advocates, and to explain the interconnection between the role of advocates and culturally based understanding of role of relatives. Okay, next slide. So this was the definition we came up with on the role of advocates. We said that they are biased supporters, and they of women and other survivors who have been raped, battered, or raped. Bias is a key word. We're biased supporters. Biased supporters. We're not being objective. We're not going to say, well, you maybe didn't commit that, or maybe he didn't rape her. We got to be objective here. Sometimes that's more the role of a judge or jury. That's not who we are. And so we're the biased supporters of women and other survivors who've been battered or raped. Our understanding of our relationships as advocates with women and their children and other survivors is based on our cultural beliefs as relatives. Okay. And we use the word women just because it becomes a little easier, but it's not discounting that our relatives, our male relatives, and also our LGBTQ2 spirit relatives are being raped and battered as well. So we are inclusive of them in all of our work, but I kind of cut it short and I referred to victims as mostly women. Next slide. I got to move along real quickly. It's about relationships. Any violence against women and all forms of violence lies in our ability to reclaim our roles and responsibilities as relatives. That's so incredibly important that we look at each other from with those lens, right? Okay, and we ideally role model the sacred connection, and from that can come a lot of respect, right? From the person we're working with. Next slide. And Internalized oppression can impact our work. I talked about that, where, it can become, we can start to take on some of the elements of those other systems and those other models. And we have to be really careful about that. I do peer review for some of the Department of Justice grant making, and it's amazing how some of the programs just use the language of social services and medical model. It's kind of sad. So, ask ourselves these questions all the time. Are we being a good relative, or are we just being this kind of strict professional person, right? And it's possible to be a professional, but also within the context of being a good relative. Not to focus on the negative or that sick role, like there's something wrong with them. Difference between prioritizing and being objective, right? We can prioritize some of our work, but also we're always going to be biased for that person we're working with, right? There's a phrase that's often used: you pull yourself up by the bootstraps versus healing together. This person has experienced a really traumatic event and requires some support for their healing. Okay, next slide. And I've talked a lot about this. Primary, in every instance, is safety and offender accountability. Women seek out shelter and advocacy because their power and control have been taken and they're in danger. They need safety. It's always number one. I say safety, always number one. And we can equalize the power and control tactics posed by batters by not remaking those in shelters, for example. Relatives are experts of what they need and what they want. And that's what should guide our work, is what they are telling us they need and want. So we're accountable to those that we work with. Next slide. When we did that definition back in the day, these were some of the roles that we came out with from that meeting. To advocate for those who are battered in a manner that honors, respects, and validates their culture, individuality, and experiences. To model courage and resistance in the face of oppression, intimidation, and fear. I got to court many, many times with victim survivors where their perpetrator was in the courtroom, would give us those looks, right? At the people we work with look to us to see how our reaction, and if I'm responding in a really strong, in a strong way, in a strong stance, that's going to help that person, right? So we model some of that. To listen and allow for silence. We don't always have to fill every space in time with words and sounds and so forth. It's really okay to allow that. To provide leadership and ensure that safety and confidentiality are priorities. I always say they're the cornerstone to safety. We have to be able to provide safety and our confidentiality and privacy even to those that we're working with. Next slide. To advocate for the expressed interests. We underline the word expressed for a reason, because we don't want to assume they want certain things. We want to know, we want to hear it from them. And we ask open-ended questions to say, what do you need? What do you want to do? What is it going to help you feel safe, right? How can I help you, right? Those open-ended questions versus sort of taking off with, well, she needs this and that, almost like a case plan. And we have to be careful of that. To focus attention on the operational meaning of safety and integrity of women in all the work that we do. To provide expertise based on the experience of those who are battered, raped, and their children. So we're always using that as our frame of reference, right? That's who we remain accountable to in all the work that we do, whether it's social change or systems change. Okay, next slide. To ensure that all women victim survivors that have been battered have 24-hour access to support, accurate information, crisis intervention, and other advocacy services, including legal advocacy. So understanding that criminal justice process so we can help the relatives we're working with through that system. To educate personnel within the relevant systems regarding the most effective responses to our relatives who are being battered, and also to prioritize victim confidentiality, safety and offender accountability. to be honest and truthful and explain all the available options. So in so doing, we have to do our homework and really be knowledgeable about the resources that are available, and get to know where we're referring people to, get to know them as well, because, you know, we don't want to refer someone where they're going to be re-traumatized, right? So get to know people where you're referring people to. Okay, next slide. These are the do nots, and I said many of these already, but we can't, you know, not to blame people for their violence or collude with and make excuses for bad behavior. One of the things that I really don't like is that term hurt people hurt people. To me, I think it's not proactive. It's not helpful. You know, I'm a hurt person. I wouldn't think about hurting anyone in the same manner that I was hurt with sexual abuse, right? So it's kind of like we need to look more beyond that of how it is that they came about hurting people, and they need to take personal responsibility for that, right? Attempt to mind read what he or she needs or wants, right? I already said that. And then also the expressed informed consent is so important, along with ensuring they know their rights and where this information is going to be shared if they share any with us. Okay, next slide. And I already said much of this, not to treat people as though they're sick, not to label them as cases, being careful about our terminology and our labels that we use, like clients or patients. Get survivors to cooperate with other agencies or follow rules not honoring their personal, their sovereignty or their safety. And that's so important. I can't even tell you, I've got many examples of that. You know, a case plan where a woman is court ordered to utilize, attend support groups, for example. She doesn't make one support group, and because she didn't have a ride, her car broke down middle of winter, didn't have a ride. We have to sign off if she attended all the support groups, right? I sign off and say, yes, she attended all support groups, because I'm not going to say she didn't attend one, because that's going against her case plan, right? That could be the thing that's going to break the camel's back, where she's not going to get her kids back, right? We have to be careful of those things, right? Allow task forces, meetings, or initiatives to focus on the behavior of the survivor instead of accountability of offenders and of systems. Or to speak on someone's behalf, but only do so if they're not safe enough to do so, or until they can do that themselves or with their express permission. Ignore or create barriers that prevent or limit access to safety or resources, right? We have to remove those barriers. That's part of that systems change work that is an arm of advocacy. Find out why those barriers exist and work to remove them. Okay, next slide. Shared issues, safety. Number one, poverty. Really helping, you know, those that we work with have equal access to these things, right? To housing, looking at resources, how do we make them more accessible? Looking at politics, how is it that the people we're working with impacted by politics, for example, tribal politics, jurisdictional issues. These are all issues that may impact our the tribal sovereignty and as well as women's sovereignty. They're all connected, and we have to make sure that we're sort of staying on top of them so they're not creating more problems for those that we serve. Next slide. And I've said this many times, advocates prioritize safety and accountability. And that's always number one. When you do grant writing, number one, safety and accountability, offender accountability. Safety at home with agencies, institutions. Take a woman to court. Is it safe there? If it isn't, what's not safe? Is there a waiting area that you can wait with this person? Because again, safety, no matter where it is, in your community, what's happening in the community that's creating a, you know, that sense of not having safety. Accountability includes the offender, those that collude with the offender. Again, that has to be that social change. educating social change. Often I use social media for that, just posting things, messages to the community about offender accountability. Okay, next slide. It's about advocacy, or it's about relationships, standing up together, using understanding of what it means as a Native woman to be a good relative. Okay. Next slide. Just a little saying, we're spiritual beings on a physical journey. Next slide. I'm going to turn it over to Heather. Gone a little bit over, apologize for that.
No worries. Thank you so much, Bonnie. And thank you all for attending today's workshop session for overview of the